There are moments when something in your life begins to feel different even though nothing around you seems to have changed. The same routine continues. The same people speak to you. The same plans move forward. Yet deep inside your spirit, something quietly shifts. You cannot explain it. It is not fear. It is not confusion. It is simply the sense that something is trying to get your attention. Many people ignore that moment. They tell themselves they are imagining things. They move forward with their plans and silence the feeling with distractions. Yet again and again throughout Scripture, we see that God rarely begins with loud warnings. He often begins with quiet signals that only a sensitive heart will recognize. A sudden interruption in your plans. A door that closes when everything seems certain. A strange uneasiness that refuses to disappear. Moments like these can feel frustrating, even inconvenient. But what if those moments were not accidents at all? What if the delay, the discomfort, or the interruption was actually mercy? God does not wait for someone to walk fully into danger before speaking. He warns before the fall. He redirects before the consequences become heavier than they need to be. But the problem is not that God is silent. The problem is that many people are not paying attention. They expect God to speak through dramatic miracles or unmistakable signs. They wait for something impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the quieter signals pass unnoticed. Yet the heart that learns discernment begins to notice something different. Certain moments begin to feel significant. A conversation suddenly speaks directly to a hidden struggle. A situation that once felt peaceful becomes strangely uncomfortable. Opportunities that seemed perfect suddenly disappear without explanation. These moments can easily be dismissed as coincidence. But what if they are not coincidences? What if they are invitations? Invitations to pause. Invitations to reflect. Invitations to change direction before the road ahead becomes much more difficult. Throughout the Bible, God consistently reveals His desire to guide His people before destruction appears. His warnings are not meant to frighten you. They are meant to protect you. But recognizing these warnings requires something important: a heart that listens. In this message, we are going to explore the warning signs that often appear when God is trying to get your attention. Some of them are subtle, some of them may feel uncomfortable, but every one of them carries a purpose, because when God sends a warning, it is never to harm you. It is to guide you before the path ahead becomes far more difficult. The quiet uneasiness. There are moments when everything in your life appears normal on the outside, yet something within you refuses to feel at ease. Your routine continues exactly as it always has. The same conversations happen, the same plans move forward, yet deep inside your heart, a quiet uneasiness begins to grow. You try to ignore it. You tell yourself that it is just stress. Maybe you are tired. Maybe you are overthinking things. So you keep moving forward, hoping the feeling will disappear, but it does not. The strange thing about this uneasiness is that it does not arrive with panic. It is subtle, calm, almost gentle, yet persistent enough that it keeps returning to your thoughts. This is often one of the first ways God begins to get a person's attention. God frequently speaks to the spirit before the mind understands what is happening. Your heart begins sensing a shift long before your eyes can see it. Something about a situation no longer feels the way it once did. A decision that seemed clear now feels uncertain. A relationship that once felt comfortable now carries a strange tension you cannot explain. This moment is not meant to create fear. It is meant to awaken awareness. Many believers expect God to guide them through dramatic signs, yet the earliest signals are often quiet impressions within the heart. They appear as a gentle disturbance that invites you to slow down and examine what is happening around you. The danger is that many people move too quickly. They silence the feeling with busyness. They convince themselves that determination alone will solve the discomfort growing inside them. But when peace begins fading without explanation, the heart may be trying to reveal something important. Perhaps a path you are following is leading somewhere you have not yet recognized. Perhaps a situation that once seemed harmless is beginning to shape your life in ways you did not expect. God does not always block the path immediately. Sometimes He begins by allowing the heart to notice that something has changed. That quiet uneasiness becomes the first signal. the signal that something beneath the surface deserves your attention. And when someone begins to listen to that inner disturbance instead of ignoring it, another sign often begins to appear soon after. When God interrupts your plans, there are times when you feel certain about the direction of your life. You have thought carefully about your decisions. You have prayed. You have planned. Everything appears to be moving exactly as you expected. Then suddenly something stops the path. An opportunity disappears. A conversation ends differently than you imagined. A door that once looked wide open suddenly refuses to move. In that moment, frustration quickly appears. You begin asking questions. Why did this happen? What went wrong? Why would something that seemed so promising suddenly collapse? But sometimes nothing went wrong. Sometimes the interruption itself is the message. God often speaks through disruption. When a path begins leading somewhere that could eventually harm your spirit, your character, or your future, He may allow that path to close before the consequences become visible. What feels like rejection may actually be protection. Think about how often people only understand this much later. At the time, the closed door feels painful. The plans you worked hard to build suddenly disappear, leaving confusion behind. Yet months or years later, something becomes clear. You begin to see what that path would have led to. A relationship that would have weakened your peace. A decision that would have taken you further from the life you were meant to live. An opportunity that looked good on the surface but carried consequences hidden beneath it. God sees what we cannot see. He understands the future beyond the moment we are standing in. When He interrupts our plans, it is not always to punish or discourage us. Sometimes it is to redirect us before we walk too far down the wrong road. But interruption requires humility. It requires the willingness to pause instead of forcing the door open again. Many people spend years trying to reopen doors that God intentionally closed for their protection. Wisdom asks a different question. If this door suddenly closed, what might God be trying to reveal? Because when a path ends unexpectedly, another truth often begins revealing itself not far behind. When peace quietly leaves. There are moments when a situation once felt completely right. You stepped into it with confidence. Your heart felt calm. Your thoughts were clear. Everything about the direction you were moving seemed aligned with the peace you carried inside. Then something begins to change. The situation itself may still look the same from the outside, yet the peace that once surrounded it slowly disappears. Conversations that once felt natural now feel heavy. Decisions that once felt simple now bring hesitation. What once felt calm begins to feel unsettled in a way that is difficult to explain. Many people ignore this moment. They tell themselves the feeling will pass. They continue pushing forward, hoping that time will restore the same confidence they once had. But the absence of peace can sometimes be one of the clearest signals that something deeper deserves attention. Peace often accompanies alignment with truth. When someone is walking in a direction that reflects wisdom, integrity, and faith, there is usually a steady calm within the heart. Life may still contain challenges, but beneath those challenges there remains a quiet confidence that you are standing where you are meant to stand. When that peace begins to fade, it invites reflection. Something about the situation may no longer be aligned with what your spirit recognizes as right. A relationship that once felt supportive may now be influencing you in ways that slowly weaken your clarity. A decision that once seemed promising may now reveal details that were hidden in the beginning. God does not always remove a person from the situation immediately. Sometimes He allows the peace to disappear so that you begin asking deeper questions. The discomfort becomes an invitation to examine the path you are walking instead of continuing forward without awareness. This moment does not demand panic. It invites attention. Because when peace quietly leaves a situation, it may be asking you to pause and look more carefully at what is unfolding around you. And when someone begins to examine that loss of peace honestly, another sign often begins to appear soon after. When the same situation keeps returning, there are times when a difficulty appears in your life once and then disappears. But there are other times when the same kind of struggle keeps returning again and again. almost as if life itself is repeating the same moment with different faces. The people may change, the circumstances may look slightly different, but the outcome feels strangely familiar. The same disappointment, the same frustration, the same lesson waiting to be understood. Many people call this bad luck. They believe they are simply unfortunate, as if certain problems follow them without reason. Yet often there is something deeper happening beneath the surface. When a lesson has not been fully understood, life has a way of presenting that lesson again. God is patient. He does not always force immediate consequences when someone walks in the wrong direction. Instead, He often allows patterns to repeat so that the heart has time to recognize what is happening. Think about the stories in Scripture. The people of Israel repeatedly experienced cycles of blessing, warning, correction, and restoration. Each cycle carried the same invitation: learn the lesson before the consequences grow heavier. This pattern still appears in people's lives today. Someone may repeatedly enter relationships that bring the same emotional pain. Someone may continue making decisions that lead to the same financial struggle. Someone may ignore the same quiet conviction, only to face the same result months or years later. At some point, the question must change. Instead of asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" wisdom asks, "What is this trying to teach me?" Because repetition is rarely meaningless. Sometimes it is mercy. God allows the situation to appear again so that the person has another opportunity to recognize the truth they missed the first time. The pattern becomes a signal that something within the heart or within one's choices needs deeper reflection. Ignoring the pattern only allows it to continue. But the moment someone recognizes the lesson hidden inside the repetition, the cycle can finally begin to break. Understanding replaces confusion. Awareness replaces frustration. And suddenly, what once felt like an endless struggle begins revealing itself as a message that had been patiently waiting to be understood. When someone finally begins seeing those patterns clearly, something else often becomes noticeable as well. A voice inside the heart that refuses to remain silent. The conviction that refuses to leave. There are moments when something in your heart keeps returning to your thoughts no matter how much you try to ignore it. You continue with your day. You focus on your responsibilities. You try to move past the feeling. Yet the same quiet awareness keeps appearing again and again. It shows up during silence. It appears when you are alone with your thoughts. It surfaces when you pray. Sometimes it even returns when you are trying to distract yourself with other things. You try to reason with it. You tell yourself it is not important. You convince yourself that time will make it disappear. Yet the strange thing about this feeling is that it refuses to leave. This is often what conviction feels like. Conviction is different from guilt. Guilt pushes a person toward shame and fear. Conviction, however, reveals something that needs to change while still pointing toward restoration. It does not exist to condemn you. It exists to guide you. When God places conviction in the heart, it is usually because something within a person's life has begun drifting away from what is right. A habit may have slowly taken a place it should not have. A decision may be leading toward consequences that have not yet become visible. Instead of forcing immediate correction, God often allows that awareness to remain. The message returns quietly but persistently, waiting for the moment when the person is willing to listen. Many people try to silence conviction with busyness. They fill their days with activity so they do not have to face what their heart is trying to reveal. Yet even in the quiet of the night, the same awareness returns. Something in your life deserves attention. This persistence is not punishment. It is patience. God allows conviction to remain because He desires correction before consequences grow heavier. He invites the heart to recognize what needs to change before the situation becomes more painful. And when someone finally stops running from that conviction and begins listening carefully, something else often begins to happen. Life itself begins slowing down in ways that are difficult to explain. When life suddenly slows down, there are seasons when everything in your life seems to lose its momentum. Plans that once moved forward quickly begin slowing down. Opportunities that seemed close suddenly feel distant. Efforts that once produced results now appear to stand still. At first, this moment feels frustrating. You begin questioning your efforts. You wonder if something went wrong. You try to push harder, believing that more effort will restore the movement you once experienced. But no matter how hard you try, the pace of your life remains slower than you expected. Many people interpret this moment as failure. They believe something is broken in their plans or in their abilities. But sometimes the slowing of life is not failure at all. Sometimes it is guidance. God often uses waiting to reveal things that a rushed life would never notice. When everything moves quickly, people rarely pause long enough to examine their direction. They simply continue forward, assuming that progress alone proves they are on the right path. But when life slows down, something important happens. The noise begins to fade. In that quieter space, hidden details begin to appear. Situations that once looked simple begin revealing deeper layers. Decisions that once seemed obvious now invite deeper thought. Waiting creates space for wisdom. Throughout Scripture, many of God's greatest works unfolded during seasons that looked like delay. Joseph spent years in circumstances that seemed far from the future he had been promised. David waited long before the crown he had been anointed for finally appeared. What looked like delay was preparation. God was shaping their understanding before allowing them to step into what was ahead. The same pattern often appears in our lives. When the pace of life slows unexpectedly, it may be an invitation to examine the path more carefully. It may be protecting you from rushing into something that is not yet ready, or something that was never meant for you. Waiting can feel uncomfortable, but sometimes the slowing of life is not meant to stop you. It is meant to guide you. And when someone begins to recognize that delay itself may carry meaning, another change often begins appearing around them. Certain people who once seemed permanent begin quietly disappearing from their lives. When certain people begin to disappear, there are moments in life when someone who once seemed permanently part of your world suddenly begins to fade from it. At first, the change is subtle. Conversations become less frequent. The closeness that once existed slowly weakens. Eventually, the connection disappears altogether. This can feel painful. You begin asking yourself what happened. You wonder if something went wrong. Sometimes you try to restore the relationship the way it once was, believing that if you make enough effort, things will return to normal. But sometimes the change is not something you caused. Sometimes it is something God allowed. Not every person who enters your life is meant to remain there forever. Some relationships exist for a specific season. They serve a purpose for a particular moment in your journey. When that purpose is fulfilled, the connection may begin to fade. This does not always happen dramatically. Often it happens quietly. Someone who once influenced your daily decisions may slowly become distant. Conversations that once shaped your thinking may no longer occur. The person who once felt central to your life begins moving in a different direction. At first, this feels like loss, but sometimes it is protection. God understands how deeply people can influence each other. The voices we listen to shape our choices, our beliefs, and even the direction of our lives. When a relationship begins leading someone away from truth or away from the path God intends, distance may begin forming. This distance is not always punishment. Sometimes it is redirection. The absence of certain voices creates space for new clarity. Without realizing it, a person may begin hearing God's guidance more clearly when the distractions around them become quieter. Looking back, many people eventually recognize something important. The people who disappeared were not necessarily enemies. They were simply part of a chapter that had reached its end. God was not removing them to harm you. He was making room for the next part of your journey. And when certain voices grow quiet, something else often begins to grow stronger. Your spiritual sensitivity begins to awaken in ways you had not noticed before. When your spiritual sensitivity begins to awaken, there comes a moment in the journey of faith when something inside you begins to sharpen. Situations that once seemed ordinary now feel different. Conversations that once passed unnoticed suddenly carry deeper meaning. Moments that once looked random now feel connected in ways you cannot easily explain. This is often the beginning of spiritual sensitivity. At first, it may surprise you. You begin noticing things you once overlooked. A certain decision suddenly feels heavier than it should. A simple conversation leaves a deeper impression on your heart. Even the atmosphere of certain places begins to affect your peace in ways you never experienced before. Many people misunderstand this change. They assume they are simply becoming more emotional or more cautious. But often, something deeper is happening. When a person begins paying attention to the quiet signals God places in their life, their awareness naturally grows stronger. Discernment begins to develop. Discernment is not the ability to predict the future. It is the ability to recognize what is happening beneath the surface of a moment. It allows you to sense when something is aligned with truth and when something is quietly pulling you away from it. This sensitivity does not appear suddenly. It grows as a result of listening. When someone begins paying attention to the uneasiness they once ignored, the interruptions they once resisted, and the convictions they once avoided, their spiritual awareness becomes clearer. The heart becomes more attentive to the guidance God has always been offering. With that awareness, situations that once confused you begin making more sense. You begin recognizing patterns sooner. You begin noticing warning signs before they become painful consequences. What once felt like random difficulty begins revealing itself as guidance you simply had not yet learned to recognize. This awakening does not make life easier, but it makes life clearer. You begin seeing things the way they truly are rather than the way they first appear. And as this clarity grows, something else often begins to happen as well. The same message begins appearing in places you did not expect. When the same message begins appearing everywhere. There are moments when a certain message begins appearing in your life again and again, almost as if the world around you is quietly repeating the same lesson from different directions. At first, you may not notice it. You hear something during a sermon that feels strangely personal. Later that week, you read a passage of scripture that speaks about the exact same subject. A few days later, a conversation with someone unexpectedly brings up the very issue you have been thinking about. The same idea keeps returning. It appears through different voices, different situations, different moments of your day. Yet each time it carries the same quiet message. Many people dismiss this pattern as coincidence. They assume it is simply chance that the same topic appears repeatedly in their lives. But when the same message continues showing up through different paths, it may be something much more meaningful. God often confirms His guidance through repetition. A single thought can be ignored. One moment of conviction can be dismissed. But when the same message appears again and again, it becomes harder to overlook. Scripture shows this pattern many times. When God wanted someone to understand something important, the message was often repeated. Dreams, signs, conversations, and circumstances aligned until the meaning became clear. Repetition creates clarity. It allows the heart to recognize that something deeper is happening beneath the surface of ordinary events. The repeated message becomes a signal that God is patiently guiding your attention toward something important. This does not happen to overwhelm you. It happens to awaken you. When a believer begins noticing that the same lesson is appearing everywhere they turn, it often means the moment has arrived to pause and truly listen. Something in your life is asking to be understood before you continue moving forward. And when someone finally stops long enough to listen to that repeated message, another realization often begins forming in their heart. Ignoring these signals can carry consequences that many people do not see coming. The danger of ignoring the signs. There is a moment when a person begins to sense that something in their life is not right. The signs are there. The uneasiness in the heart. The interruptions in their plans, the loss of peace that once guided their decisions. Yet even with all these signals, many people choose to continue forward as if nothing is happening. This is where danger begins to grow. Ignoring a warning does not make the warning disappear. It only allows the situation to continue developing without correction. God often speaks early because His desire is to prevent the consequences that could come later. But when the warnings are dismissed, the path continues in the same direction. Think about how often this happens in everyday life. Someone senses that a decision feels wrong, yet they continue because the opportunity seems too good to walk away from. Someone notices that a relationship is influencing them in ways that weaken their peace, yet they remain because leaving feels uncomfortable. The heart may already recognize the problem, but the mind finds reasons to ignore it. This is how many people slowly move further away from the path they once knew was right. The signs appear early, quietly inviting reflection, yet the moment of reflection never arrives. God does not remove our ability to choose. He offers guidance, but the decision to listen remains ours. Throughout Scripture, we see that warnings often came before consequences. Prophets spoke before judgment arrived. Opportunities for change appeared before destruction unfolded. Yet when those warnings were ignored, the outcome that followed was often far more painful than the original correction would have been. The purpose of a warning is mercy. It is the opportunity to change direction while the road ahead can still be altered. Ignoring that opportunity does not stop the journey. It simply allows the journey to continue toward whatever lies ahead. But there is still hope in this moment, because recognizing that the signs have been ignored can become the very moment when a person begins to turn back and listen again. And when someone becomes willing to listen, something else begins to appear. A new direction slowly starts to reveal itself. When God begins redirecting your path, there are moments when a person suddenly realizes that the direction of their life is beginning to change, not through a dramatic announcement, not through a single event that explains everything. Instead, the shift happens gradually, almost quietly, as if the road itself is slowly turning in a new direction. At first, the change feels uncertain. The plans you once believed were permanent begin losing their importance. Opportunities that once seemed necessary no longer carry the same weight in your heart. What once felt like the only path forward now appears to be only one possibility among many. This is often the moment when God begins redirecting a life. Redirection rarely feels comfortable in the beginning. The human heart prefers certainty. It prefers clear plans and predictable outcomes. But when God begins guiding someone toward a new direction, the transition often begins with a period of uncertainty. Doors that once opened easily may close. New possibilities begin appearing in places you had not considered before. Conversations that once seemed ordinary begin planting ideas you had never thought about. Little by little, the path begins shifting. God does not always reveal the entire destination immediately. Sometimes He simply changes the direction of the next step. The purpose is not confusion. The purpose is guidance. When someone has been ignoring warning signs, redirection can feel like disruption. The life they planned begins unraveling in ways they did not expect. Yet what looks like disruption may actually be restoration, because the path you were following may not have led where you truly needed to go. God understands the purpose of your life far better than any plan you could create. When He begins redirecting your steps, He is not removing something valuable from you. He is guiding you towards something that aligns more deeply with the person you were meant to become. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable, but with time, clarity begins to appear. The pieces that once looked scattered begin forming a pattern. Situations that once confused you begin making sense, and eventually, there comes a moment when a person looks back and realizes something surprising. God had been speaking the entire time. The moment you realize God was speaking, there comes a moment when the confusion of the past begins to clear. It does not happen suddenly like a flash of lightning. It happens quietly, almost gently, as if pieces of your life are finally beginning to fall into place. You start looking back. Situations that once frustrated you begin to make sense. The door that closed unexpectedly, the delay that once felt unfair, the relationship that slowly faded away. Each moment that once seemed random begins forming a pattern you could not see before. And slowly a realization begins to grow inside you. God was speaking, not through a single dramatic moment, but through many quiet ones, through interruptions you once resisted, through discomfort you once tried to silence, through warnings that appeared again and again while you were too busy to notice. Looking back changes everything. What once felt like loss now looks like protection. What once felt like confusion now appears as guidance. The path that seemed broken begins revealing itself as something carefully redirected. Many people only recognize this later. At the time, they believed their plans were falling apart. They believed the delays meant failure. They believed the closed doors meant rejection. But with time, clarity arrives. You begin to see that if certain things had not ended, you might have continued walking in a direction that would have led you further away from the life you were meant to live. God's guidance often becomes clearer in reflection. He was speaking through the quiet uneasiness that appeared before something changed. He was speaking through the loss of peace that invited you to pause. He was speaking through the repetition of the same lesson that refused to disappear. And when that realization finally settles in the heart, something powerful happens. Gratitude replaces frustration. You begin to understand that what once looked like obstacles were actually moments of mercy. God was not trying to stop your life. He was trying to guide it. And when someone finally sees that truth, another realization begins forming soon after. Those warnings were not just about the past. They were also an invitation for the future. Recognizing the call to return, there is a moment when everything becomes clear enough that ignoring it is no longer possible. The signs that once felt uncertain now feel unmistakable. The interruptions, the delays, the convictions in your heart all begin pointing toward the same realization. God has been calling you to return, not because He wants to condemn you, not because He wants to punish you, but because He wants to bring you back to the path where peace, clarity, and purpose begin to grow again. Many people misunderstand this moment. They think returning to God means admitting failure. They think it means acknowledging that they were wrong about the direction they chose. But the truth is very different. Recognizing the call to return is not a moment of defeat. It is a moment of awakening. It is the moment when someone finally becomes honest with themselves, honest about the choices they made, honest about the signs they ignored, honest about the direction their life was beginning to take. And that honesty opens the door to something powerful: restoration. Throughout Scripture, we see this pattern again and again. When someone recognizes God's call and turns back toward Him, the story does not end in condemnation. It begins again with mercy. The warnings that once felt uncomfortable reveal their true purpose. They were never meant to push you away. They were meant to guide you back. God does not send warnings because He wants to frighten you. He sends them because He loves you enough to correct the path before it leads somewhere painful. And when a person finally recognizes that call to return, a deep peace often begins to grow where uncertainty once lived. Because the heart that turns back toward truth no longer needs to fear the road ahead. It can finally begin walking forward again with clarity. Closing reflection. There are moments in life when the noise of the world becomes quiet enough for a person to look back and see their journey with new clarity. The confusion that once surrounded certain events begins to fade. Situations that once felt random now reveal a pattern that was hidden at the time. You begin to recognize something you could not see before. God was speaking, not always through dramatic signs, not always through moments that everyone around you would notice. Most of the time, He was speaking through quiet signals that only a listening heart could understand. The uneasiness that appeared before something changed. The door that closed when your plans seemed certain. The peace that slowly disappeared from a situation that once felt right. Each of these moments carried a message. God was guiding you. He was protecting you from paths you could not yet see clearly. He was slowing you down when rushing forward might have brought consequences you were not prepared for. He was removing voices that could have led you away from the purpose prepared for your life. What once looked like confusion now reveals itself as mercy. God does not wait until destruction appears before He speaks. He warns early. He redirects quietly. He invites reflection before the road ahead becomes more difficult. But recognizing His guidance requires something important: a heart willing to listen. When someone learns to notice the quiet signals of God's direction, life begins to look different. Situations are no longer judged only by appearance. Decisions are no longer made only by convenience. Instead, a deeper awareness begins guiding the way forward. Discernment grows, and with discernment comes peace. Not because life suddenly becomes free of challenges, but because you begin walking with greater awareness of the one who is guiding your steps. So when the next moment of quiet warning appears in your life, do not dismiss it too quickly. Pause. Listen carefully, because sometimes the smallest signal is the very moment when God is trying to get your attention.